the first session of the course. I'll formally welcome Professor Chattopadhyay. Professor Shati Chattopadhyay is a professor of architecture and comparative literature at University of California, Santa Barbara. Welcome. The floor is yours. Yes.
Are we all ready? Thank you all for coming. It's a delight to be here. So what I thought I'd do in the first lecture is talk about some basic ideas of cities and take you to a time where usually you wouldn't think about, because this is, part of the ancient world. Because to understand contemporary cities, you do need to understand something about the history of cities. And I begin with something very basic. What are cities? As a question, do you know what is a city? Okay. I don't know what happened to the light. Can I have a look? Oh, okay. Light's gone. Okay, great. So, what are cities? If I say, are they defined by size? Are they defined by population? Are they, it's about occupation? What would be a correct answer? When I ask a question, I expect an answer. So what are cities? What do you think is a city? Do you know a city when you see it? Is it defined by size? Sorry, could you speak louder?
I would say it's a combination of all to begin with, but I would say it's a concentrated space with far more infrastructural development than rural areas. By saying this, I mean I'm aware that I'm basing the definition or the idea of city on the basis of what is not rural. That's where I begin.
That's very good. In other words, you're invoking the rural to define the urban. In other words, there's some kind of relationship you're already presuming in a comparative framework. Okay, and it is one thing that I think most people, and there's lots of debates and arguments, people would agree that there's something about concentrated settlements. But what kind of concentrated settlement? The fact is, historically, the size and the type of concentration has varied so much that there is no acceptable parameters of what a city is. In modern times, we do describe cities in terms of every country, every region has a way of designating cities. But it's useful to think about the idea that cities are really kind of, complex, I'm going to use the term artifacts, but they're also processual. And they have changed, and there are particular historical sort of legacies of this. So one thing that you have already invoked, that when we think about anything urban, we are already thinking of as something rural. And what is rural? Most of let's say the space that we encountered between the airport and the campus, would you describe that as a city?
Outskirts.
Outskirts is not. That's just outskirt. Outskirt of what? In other words, is it a really concentrated settlement, right? But it is defined as a city, right? Am I correct? Shilchar is a city?
Right.
It's not a city?
It's a town.
It's a town, okay. So there are designations of what is a town, what is a city, what's a metropolis, what's a metropolitan area. So we have some understanding of that. But one of the important things to recognize is that no matter what it is and what the size of it is, and this is axiomatic, cities come in flocks. Cities never exist by themselves. They're always in relation to other spaces and likely other cities. And historically, different terms have been used to describe cities. The most common are the Latin term civitas, from which we get the term city, civilization, civic, all the part of the English language terms, but also polis, the city-states, which is the Greek term, and it has an immense impact on how we think about cities, because that constitutes two things. One is political, the other is material. That's Aristotle speaking. City has two functions. One is material, the other is political. How do you bring those two together is the problem of the citizens and the politicians. Now, at least in ancient China, there were sort of hierarchies in terms of jurisdiction of cities. In Sanskrit, there were lots of terms, but they were defined as function in terms of functional difference, in terms of hierarchy. So, market town is designated differently from a port city. So something to pay attention to, that historically those functional distinctions and size distinctions have been important. It's not one of our modern day manufacture. But there are also terms like Shahr and Medina, which have an immense role to play in terms of how we think our cities, how should cities be assembled. Cities are assembled entities, they just don't happen. They are, even those cities that look unplanned, they are planned, they're intentional. But intentions are complex, and a lot of things are more than intentions. So where were the first cities? You probably know this. It's less important where were the cities, more important is why the cities were there to begin with. Of course, the most important reason is that these were riverine regions. In other words, the river as a source of water, as a source of transportation, as a source of agriculture, was extremely important for the sustenance and growth of these cities. Most of these cities, not all, were actually defined as sort of defensible entities, a concentrated sort of population where you're taking care of basically the surplus resources. So the resource problem, and particularly the need for water, ensured that cities necessarily again came in flux. Now, urban theorists, historians debate about what are the reasons for settling cities. Couldn't you have lots of different, let's say, small-scale rural settlements? Why concentrate resources and populations in one place? Because it also makes you more vulnerable. But there are lots of arguments about this. Now, the two most common ones are that it's the defense and the management of agricultural surplus. In other words, that presumes that you actually have an agricultural region that you're controlling. And the second one is trade, that you want to trade in those. So surplus production and then trade in those products and then manufacturing. What it allowed, the surplus production allowed, is one group of the peasantry to become craftsmen, artisans, so they could specialize. So specialization is considered extremely important in city growth. And the last is warfare, is that you concentrate your resources, you protect your resources. That's the defense of your resources. Most ancient cities, really until the 19th century, were walled cities, and they were necessarily walled. Modern cities are typically not walled, but there are also exceptions. And one of the biggest exceptions, the most important exceptions, is the city of Caral in Peru. It has evidence of monumental infrastructure, monumental architectural works, and that is considered one extremely important sort of a characteristic of cities of any kind. They have, it's a pre-ceramic civilization, so they have all kinds of ways of producing, organizing food supply without ceramics, which is quite extraordinary. They have evidence of excellent infrastructural construction, architectural construction, but they have no defensive walls. There's no evidence of warfare, and that is exceptional. Perhaps the exception proves the rule. What that tells you is that defense is not the most important criteria. The one that has been considered very important in the growth and maintenance of ancient and medieval cities. Now, technologies, and technology is anything that extends human reach. It's like the monkey stick. So anything that extends our reach. You don't need to have these kinds of fancy gizmos. This is a technology. Your pencil is a technology. All of these are technologies. So in terms of cities, there's a long list, and I don't expect you to remember all of these, but there's a long list of technologies which were considered absolutely basic for building cities, for managing cities, and that is administering cities. And some of these have to do with actually artifactual manufacture, that is, you have metalwork, pottery, and so on and so forth. The other is actually mathematical calculations, maintaining calendars and predicting time and writing. But there are cities which there's no evidence of writing. So you have to think about how did they communicate? How did they organize their labor? Because cities are fundamentally about organizing and managing labor. So if these, from pottery, metalworking, mathematics, astronomical observation, calendar, writing, plow, and grain cultivations are fundamental to cities, not all cities always had these. And urbanists and urban theorists get very picky when thinking about what is a city and what is not a city. Let's think of one settlement which there's a lot of debate about, and this is where I invoke the city of Çatalhöyük in the Anatolian plain and in Konya in Turkey. So you can see that here, this is of course the great Sumerian civilizations and the cities associated with the civilizations, the Tigris and Euphrates, and Çatalhöyük is here. It possibly at some point had other cities and communication with other cities, but dating to 7000 BCE, it is a settlement of a peculiar kind. So one of its major resources was obsidian, which is volcanic rock. So there was a volcano in close proximity. So they traded in obsidian, they manufactured obsidian. There is evidence of extraordinary material culture, from jewelry to sort of different kinds of vessels, different kinds of figurines, and of course evidence of sharpened tools. This is obsidian and with the handle sharpened into a tool. And one of the things that as architectural historians we love is that there are a lot of wall paintings, and this is one of my favorites because these are leopards drawn on the wall. One of the things, and if you think about what the people of Çatalhöyük did, they were farmers, they were foragers. They did sort of I like to think of multi-occupational multi-occupational lifestyles. But when we think of foragers, people who are hunting and gathering, we don't associate that with cities. And this is a deep bias in sort of historical understanding. But these people did that, and they also cultivated. So there's evidence of cultivation, there's evidence of hunting, there's evidence of foraging. But one of the things that delights architectural urban historians is that it has what is understood to be the oldest city map. And you're looking at that. And if you, I'm going to talk a little more about architectural plans and city maps. So this is let's think of it as a map or a plan. If you look at this, can you understand what is represented here? Yeah.
Houses.
So you think these are houses, right? Yeah. So so let's see, these dark spaces are built spaces, right? And these are open spaces, right? Is that good? That's pretty good. Now this is supposed to be a representation of the volcano. Okay. So in other words, they're really not thinking about in terms of our modern conceptions of mapping. It's the proximity of the volcano and the settlement that is obviously not accurate, but they are conceptually close. So it makes sense to put them close. But if you notice this and you go, okay, this is very interesting because it seems like a very tight-knit community. Mind you, it is an archaeological site and there are two sites. We're looking at only one part of the site. So there's something about any settlement, whether it is our contemporary settlements or historical settlements, the form of the city, how they're organized, how spaces are organized, how tall they are, how spread out they are, what kind of building types are included, tell us something about the vision of the community, whether it's a political community, social community. So there is something about the physical form of a city and the, let's call them the ideologies and the ideas that support that community. One of the interesting things about Çatalhöyük is that there doesn't seem to be evidence of streets. The settlement did not have streets. So that kind of undercuts any of our understanding of what a city is, because we presume cities, really any settlements, should have streets. Well, these people seem to have done very well without streets, because they would actually climb up the roof and use a ladder and go use the terraces as spaces of movement and come down from the terrace to the dwelling. So that because we are not used to the idea, that doesn't mean it wasn't perfectly plausible. So one of the reasons that urbanists think, well, Shuttlehague is not really a city is because it didn't have streets. Because street frameworks and infrastructure is so important in our modern conceptions of cities. So this is what, and this is a conjectural depiction of what Shuttlehague might look like. So it is, think of it as a terrace landscape. Okay, it's not a really landscape, not as in the land and the ground. But, and this is a plan from the archaeological dig. So there would be, these are the openings from the roof that people would use to enter the spaces. But it's more complicated than that. And this is part of the plan, and I'm looking at this part here. Okay, that's a plan of a house. If you don't know how to exactly read architectural plans, I'll talk about that later a bit. So there's some clustering of spaces, closely clustered spaces. But each individual house is a unit, so they could build independently. In other words, they did not share walls. One house and another house did not share walls. So you could build independently, and they did build independently. So what you see here are, looks like two overlapping spaces. Marks here suggest that the ladder was placed in that location, and we can decipher different, let's not call them rooms, but certainly different spaces. And the different spaces were designated, and they were clearly not called store and living room, those are English terms, but from the function of the way the space was used, we can sort of discern that those were the uses of the spaces. So the importance of a shrine is very important aspect of it. And so this is an axonometric of that one unit plan. And there's a ladder coming from the top, and there's an open hearth. There's space for warmth and cooking. There are sleeping platforms. And these two overlapping forms, they actually had changed over the years. So these conjectural, images, and this looks very much like something out of southwestern United States, and it's really informed by some of those visions of space, because we don't know what they look like. So when you project, and this is very important, when you project what a space was like and what were the intentions like, you're always going into the realm of fiction. You're imagining what a space is, because you have certain kinds of evidence, then you're projecting it. Something lies in that realm of projection, which allows you to create a pictorial form, which of course is not 100% correct, and it's not, it's a conjectural image. But there is evidence that, horns of the very large bulls were used as to construct ritual spaces. Those animals were clearly very important to the life base of the people. So we can infer a lot of different things. But this, this house form that I was looking at, but once you look at it historically over the years, you recognize that sometimes those two units were separate, then they came together, and in other words, the walls were changed. And one reason perhaps the walls were changed, because the people of Shuttlehague buried their ancestors under the floor, and they built up one layer over another. So you have to think of the city not just as a horizontal expanse, but as a vertical expanse. So think in section. And this is why it's kind of important to recognize that what the top layer we see, this is the basic of stratigraphy in archaeology, that the top layer is the newest, and the bottom layer is the oldest. So, and here in Shuttlehague, there are 12 confirmed layers of habitation. Of course, this is over centuries, but it is significant. We don't build like that. Okay, we have a very different ethos of building. So, it's important to think about what other possible ways people have handled these kinds of works. Now, below floor burial is not exceptional. People of Shuttlehague are not exceptional. Other cultures did that. But it is the reason I'm showing this is because when we talk about settlement, cities and settlement in terms of a concentrated location of people and resources, we need to think very much in terms of what other possibilities are there of expansion. Think of community expansion, whether we typically expand upwards, we typically expand, sideways. But that possibility was also understood. In other words, what is the relation between the land, the sky, and earth is very important. Of course, the rules of stratigraphy become kind of, let's say, muddy in the region that we are in, which is the Brahma and Gangetic plains. Because here, water moves the land. Land is not stable. We're going to talk about that problem or maybe a prospect later. So here I want to, I'm obeying the sort of the Abhishek's request that I keep to 1 hour. So Abhishek, I have a question here. It's 12:05 now. When do you want me to complete? I'll continue based on that.
35.
Okay, then we have plenty of time. So what I want us to think about, after saying that these people in Çatalhöyük, they built down, they settled, they knew their ancestors. That space mattered to them in a very material, deep lineage sense. And it is very typical to think of cities as permanent settlements. And that's a valid way of thinking about cities. But cities, and this is very interesting, is because cities are both permanent and not permanent. They are fundamentally moved by modes of circulation, modes of travel that, let's say, unsettle them. But this is not just sort of something metaphorical. Many settlements, and I'm picking up a strand from medieval, from the 1500s onwards, is that many settlements were really mobile settlements. One example is the little fair town of Bandar Abbas. You probably know where the location is. It's in the state of Hormuz, and it's extremely important because it guards that little space between the Sea of Oman and the Persian Gulf. So it is actually, this is its hinterland, and this is the time of the Safavid Empire coming into being. It was a very important place of trade, but it was seasonal. In other words, can you imagine why it was seasonal? Why would a trade settlement be seasonal? Sorry?
Because of the monsoon winds.
Because of the monsoon winds. Excellent. Because in other words, when ships came, they gathered and then they scattered, right? So much of what we think about cities until the 19th century, they were guided by monsoon winds. Other trade winds guided settlements and settlement patterns and trade and so on and so forth. Now we take that and think about movements of people. What does it matter? And how these what we think of as permanent or a settlement come into existence? We notice interesting patterns. Mind you, the Safavids and their adjacent ones, the Ottomans and the other side, the Mughals, they had large territorial empires. But so many of them had moving parts. One of the parts that I would wish to talk about later is the idea of the Mufassil. Mufassil was a revenue collecting point. So it is very impermanent, but then they grew into other entities later. There's a historical process through which these spaces grow. I want to, and here I'm jumping into from the ancient plains of Konya to early modern area, the late medieval Europe. I want to think about the reason I invoked the city of Bandar Abbas is because it's important to think about how really small settlements, and you can barely call them settlements, come together as either flocks or as sort of generate more, sort of something gets aggregated around the nucleus of those initial trade to create larger patterns. So in the, let's say, 1500s, there were literally hundreds of fairs being held in what is, this is the boundaries of modern France. Of course, there's no modern France then, but to give you a sense of what would be considered within the territorial entity. And I'm going to briefly look at the town of Troyes, which is in the Champagne region, and it's on the Seine. Now, the town is here, so here is Paris. Okay, take a look at this map here. It has three distinct trade routes, the ones in black, the ones in sort of this, pink, and one in, kind of blue, and the one in red. And these are the Hanseatic routes. These are the blues are the Venetian routes, the red are the Genoese, and the blues are the ones that are combined. And then, of course, there are overland trade routes, the dotted ones. And this is just showing that part of Western Europe. Okay. What had happened by 1500, 1600 is that the quote-unquote feudal landscape, it is very debated. People don't like using the term feudal landscape, but we will let that go. That landscape, very scattered landscape of Europe, absolutely sort of devastated by repeated attacks, was coming together slowly and gathering some kind of momentum in terms of trade. So movement across the land and across the water was still very risky because, well, you could be just robbed. It's not complicated. You just could be robbed. But merchants, came into agreements with folks in towns, and they could be bishops, they could be lords of those domains, or citizens. And these are cities, these are small towns which are getting their charters. In other words, they're getting free, free of feudal bondage. In other words, they are not beholden to their overlords in the agricultural system. So they're coming together in sort of new formations. And it's very interesting to study new formations because it tells you something about what has worked in the past and what kind of complicated sort of systems come together to produce these artifacts that we call cities. So Troyes is a fair town, and it was a very old Roman town. This part is the Roman town, which had been, the walls had been devastated many, many times. It's a long story. We don't have to get into the long story. But what was peculiar to Troyes and its claim to fame is that it held both the hot July-August fair and the cold November-December fair. Twice, that means Troyes was entertaining merchants, and this is long-distance trade. This is valuable trade. Do you have any idea what that valuable trade in Europe, circa 1500, could be, or even earlier than that? What are the trades that are really valuable? Spices would be one. Sorry? Textiles. Okay. And textiles, this could be, woolen, wool, silk, right? Yeah. What else?
Grains.
Sorry?
Grains.
Grain, yeah, grain would be, because grain has to be moved, okay. And we are not talking about the days of the Roman Empire where, massive sources of grain are, they reached out to to the steppes of Russia. But still, grain has to be, gotten from somewhere, right? So, transaction of grain's important. What else? Sorry?
Gemstones.
Gemstones, okay. In other words, gold, silver, yeah, very important. So all of these require that you have secured spaces, okay? Otherwise, nobody's going to move that. So a couple of things happen, and you might know this, that in places like this, these spaces of these markets would develop, and this is basically, the city was earlier this part, and it had, these are the churches, small town full of churches. So this street would be extended. So this is the grain market here, actually, okay? And there would be warehouses would be built, and you have to recognize in the early sort of late medieval or sort of between, let's say, the 12th century and 16th century, entire sort of vocabulary of building types are being learned and being created. So like, what does a warehouse look like in 1250 Troyes? Okay, well, not that big from our conception, or nothing compared to what the Ottomans and the Safavids would create, which are huge, massive structures, because they were territorial empires. These are not territorial empires, they're small spaces. They're really small, and they're narrow. And streets were, yes, some of the existing streets, they're that narrow, and these are some of the examples of the burghers' houses, with the merchant houses. which are, really closely sort of next to each other, really proximate. They're narrow spaces, but this is considered an important expansion. They had rebuilt the wall. They had, created certain ways of controlling traffic, of hosting precious cargo. So if I have to diagram, all of these complex cities, and they came in many forms. So this is an example of Lennep, Germany, and this is Barcelona, and many of these are old Roman towns which have been sort of reorganized, and they come in all forms. They might look kind of haphazard, but they're not. They're actually very intentionally that. Okay, there's nothing called unplanned towns. They're all planned in some way. But if I have to kind of diagrammatize all of that, it would be that what is the desired outcomes is that you will have an enclosure, a wall, and walls could look like this, and you should be able to close that. And that is important because it's not just defense. As soon as gunpowder comes in, those walls don't do anything, okay? So they're not of limited use. But they do something else, which is they're very important for collecting tolls. And that's one of the security the merchants got. If you paid the toll, you were protected within that space of the town. And so the gate and the centralized market, and markets again were not in the sort of the geographical center always. It could be lopsided from our perception, but they are centric. In other words, that space, the city is formed around that space. And in many towns in England, like in this one in Salisbury, there would be market crosses. This is the Cross of Peace. This is actually overseen either by the Lord or the bishop, which means that this is a place where you can transact trade in a peaceable manner. Because one of the problems was that you bring goods to the market and you'll be robbed. This was routine, mind you. Okay, so the Cross of Peace, and it's very interesting, this architecture delineation. It looks like a crown, and of course with a cross on top, is because that's the mark of authority, that the trade is protected by some other kind of, whether it is ecclesiastical or other kinds of power. So I want you to kind of keep this in mind. And what would happen is that, so those merchants or traders who didn't want to go and pay the tolls because that's an expense, they settled outside, and that's the faubourgs, what we would later call, what generically in English we call suburbs. So faubourgs, those spaces. And so in other words, you would find these agglomerations around towns, which would then later be brought into within the realm of the town to make them bigger entities, more flourishing entities. But in other words, these are matters of slow negotiations. There's a matter of, this is a process involved in kind of developing these cities. So one of the things that started happening, and I always think about circa 1250, is the new building types. Now, do you guys know what building types are? What's a building type? We are in a building type. What is that building type? Sorry? It's an educational building, right? And what does an educational building have? They have classrooms, they'll have some offices, they'll have some, so we kind of know what that's a building type, okay? Residential, like houses, residential accommodation is a building type, okay? Townhouse are a building type. So in other words, there is some idea that when we describe a building as a type, there is a notional relation between its form and its function, okay? So in other words, they don't all, the argument can be made much more complex, but for the moment it's it's important for us to know that there's some kind of relation between the form of a building. You recognize by looking at a city hall, that's a city hall, okay? And you kind of recognize what the function of a city hall is. So new building types would emerge in medieval Europe, and there are similar processes happening elsewhere. So one of the things that, the reason I'm invoking this is that a burgher's house in a town like Troyes or, in 1250 would look like that. And this is a particular kind of construction. It is, in other words, you're putting in small timber members and you're filling these in. It's called wattle and daub. You don't have to get into that. But this is a commonsensical but very robust structure. And wattle and daub construction is found all over the world, literally. Okay? And then, if this is an image from the Netherlands. Here you have nice masonry work, but in the bottom floor you have shops. So the idea of shops underneath and merchant houses on top was very typical. And then they would start having these dedicated spaces for warehouses. Again, if you look at the bazaars of the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals, there are massive warehouses. But they are territorial empires, they have different infrastructure, they have different kind of volume of trade. So these small towns are sort of preparing for that, if you will. The reason I'm showing you this is because I want you to think about what happens when trade gets stronger, when merchants become more powerful. They make bigger claims to the city. Cities get wealthier. And we can think about different kind of political process coming into place. So the merchant, I showed you an image of this. This is a very well-known painting of a Hansa merchant from Danzig. And the Hanseatic towns, they're all in red, and the ones in, the ones that are just, outlined in red, they are small settlements. In other words, they are not considered, that's not within Hansa territory, really. One was in London, and the London was called Steelia, nothing to do with steel, by the way. So, and this is a kind of a rudimentary plan of what that was. This is the Thames. It had the offices, residential accommodation for the merchants. It had a church in it, a space to pray. It had warehouses, but very important warehouses of having warehouses as a place of trade. And this is not dissimilar to what we find as factories of the colonial powers all across India. They were really warehouses. They were not factories like manufacturing. They were warehouses connected to this thing called offices. Offices don't look like our offices. They're places of business transaction, okay, where you can show samples, where you collect revenue. And what is interesting about our merchant here is that he is surrounded by pieces of paper. He's holding in a piece of paper. So in other words, we are already in the realm of promissory notes. We are not moving bullion unprotected across territory. We are giving promissory notes. We are exchanging paper, basically. Now, something fundamentally is changing about trade, long-distance trade. You're not risking moving goods, and particularly bullion, across unfamiliar territory. You're depositing your goods, getting a, let's call it receipt, and then redeeming the receipt at another office, another board. So you're not taking the risk. Somebody else is taking the risk, right? So in other words, the merchant bankers who are taking that risk, they become extremely powerful, extremely wealthy. So the reason I'm showing you this is because a couple of reasons. One is a thing that I find very interesting. They got so powerful in London, Queen Elizabeth threw them out. She shut them out because she had her own plans of putting forth her merchant troops, if you will, at least the early East India Company. And it's important to think about the rivers as the sort of the connecting point. Think of them as being plugged into rivers, all of these new building types. But it is also useful to think about that these Hanseatic towns, they have to deal with other merchants. They have to deal with often rival powers and to control large territories. And after this, after the 16th century and already by the 15th century, this territory is no longer this. It's all about oceanic trade. It's about the New World. It's about Asia. It's about expanding trade networks. Now, the cities that came out of those, and I happen to be looking at Italian cities here. One could look at any number of cities. They developed particular kinds of building types and structures, particular kinds of physical arrangement, which are both peculiar and very instructive. So the sheets of paper that this merchant is holding in the statue of, this is Marco Dattini and Prato. This is in the center of town. There's a statue. He's not not a bishop, not a prince, is a merchant, but he gave his life's earnings, let's put it this way, to the city, because the city made him something. And he had multiple offices across Europe, okay, in other words, multiple branches. And the idea that merchants would become sort of the rulers, the new power brokers in a city, would have been unthinkable 4 centuries before in Europe, where it was absolutely ruled by ecclesiastical authorities and lords. So what changed here, and this is the important part, circulation of money took on different form. It took up, here we have the invocation of the beginnings of paper currency, paper promissory notes, because currency becomes paper. Something to keep in mind, and we're going to come back to this later. In other words, something changes about communication, about exchange. Something changes as a result about how cities are organized. Something, those kinds of communication, whether it's paper, money, they seem extra urban. Like they are not, we don't live in those things. They seem ephemeral, particularly if we're talking about paper money, it's ephemeral. But they have real, meaningful, physical parameters and impacts on the city and the ground itself. So an exemplary case is Florence. Florence was an old Roman town, a gridded Roman town which was expanded and between the 12th and 15th centuries. And what happens is that entirely new infrastructures are introduced. And this is again happening in a very large number of cities as trade is expanding, as city population is growing. And this kind of, these are both, this is a bridge, but also shops on both sides. It is a peculiar construction. You find it in the Safavid Empire, you find it all across Italy. And extensive markets, and this is the main piazza of the market. So there is another space that comes into existence, which is to do with the location of the non-ecclesiastical buildings. One is the the town hall, and that is a medieval European invention. Where the city authorities secular city authorities would get together to make decisions, very simple decisions, whether to go to war or not. These are still city-states, mind you. Okay? And the Orson Michele, which is the granary, but also guild hall. In other words, this is where the important merchants, the ones who deal with textiles, gold, silk, they are the most reputable ones. They're the most wealthy ones. Have important spaces, but representation in a guild was extremely important. And it was hierarchical, it was graded, but guilds regulated trade, regulated commerce. And what is interesting about the fact that these communities are deeply religious, the church is important. Florence has like numerous churches. The most important one, simply called Duomo because of the dome, it has a piazza, open space right next to it, but so does the town hall. And all these, those spaces that are marked, starred. So this is actually a palazzo, a palace. That's the bridge that we looked at. All these important nodes, like the physical nodes, are right on the old northwest corridor. That is the northwest street of the old Roman city. That has been expanded, extended, but they have a certain kind of centrality. So piazzas, excuse me, or open spaces where you can gather the community became very important. So this is the old town hall, and this is called a loggia. Basically, it looks like a little stage, and it's a very old precedence in Greece, the Stoa. But these kinds of open spaces become instrumental in fostering a sense of the city. They're of course sort of general gathering spaces, but between spaces like the loggia, now it is basically an urban art gallery, but also there's no better term for it. These are benches right next to the palaces of the very elite merchants. In other words, there is a relation between even private spaces and city spaces, which is extremely carefully coordinated and marked. In other words, there's an invitation for the people in general to participate in the city life. I mean, this was not necessary for the, this is not necessary for the, this is the Medici Riccardi Castle, palace. It's not necessary for them, but it is an offering to the urban space itself. So, palaces typically belong to princes, lords, and they could belong to bishops, very powerful bishops. The church, after all, was the wealthiest, institution in medieval Europe. But merchants, and these are the ones who have become extremely wealthy, and they would, basically later supply the popes and princes, would build extraordinarily lavish buildings for residences. They would separate out their offices from their residences. In other words, they conduct their business somewhere else. The house becomes a separate entity, which is a new thing by the time, this is in the 15th century. And they hired the best architects to design these, and they are, this is around open courtyard, and they have their insignia on the, you don't need an address, you just need that insignia, and how it is. And it has a particular architectural order of the rustic, this is the piano nobile and the attic, and lots of glass. This is, you don't need to know anything else about this building to know that it belongs to a very wealthy person, given how much glass. Glass is very expensive in the 15th century. But it's the same aesthetic that they would also have their architects lay on churches. They would profusely donate to churches and ecclesiastical institutions, and you would, an urban style would emerge, which would integrate the secular and the sacred in one new architectural vocabulary. What makes cities like Florence still kind of important in terms of an architectural grandeur is because how they were thought of as one part of an architectural or urban ensemble. I'm going to stop there for the moment. I think we can end the formal part of the lecture. I do want to talk about plans a bit because I will be showing a lot of plans. I just want to ensure that you know how to read a plan. Okay, you may or you may not. Okay, I'm happy to take questions after this. Is that good? Abhishek, I'm looking at you. Okay.
When we talked about the earliest cities that walls were constructed mainly for defensive purposes. So my question is whether the walls were actually for defensive purposes primarily, or was it were it reconstructed to impart a sense of centrality, a sense of concentration around the city in order to protect the surface resources?
No, it was for defense. Most cities had walls for defense. It was necessary. Okay.
Like the aim to concentrate surface resources, that was a secondary aspect of the walls.
So the thing is that, once you are bringing in the surplus and managing the surplus within the city, those resources need to be protected, okay? Because pretty much every city we look at, from the, whether the Mesopotamian cities or later cities in Europe or Asia, they are warring cities, okay? They will go to war for these resources.
Okay. Acquire resources from each other's territory.
Yeah, so that's why Karral is, we go like, what's with Karral? That it doesn't have defensive walls, it has no warfare, what's going on with Karral? So they clearly manage relations differently. Okay, we don't know a lot about cities like Karral yet, because it's all archaeological finds, so we are putting together archaeological evidence. But walls were primarily for defense, but as I said, they also had other functions, and they were clearly seen as modes of not just enclosure but exclusion. So you could exclude people from those. one example I will not get to is that there were walls within walls. Okay, so Venice, the city which did not have walls, the only part that was walled was Arsenale, which was the arsenal, which is the navy shipyard. That needed to be walled because they had their galleys there. Okay, so that part was walled. Otherwise, it's not a walled city. The other part was walled. The part that was walled was the places where the Jews lived. Okay, and that's the original ghetto, G-E-T-O. We now spell ghetto as G-H-E-T-T-O. The original ghetto is actually in Venice because Jews were not allowed to partake in long distance trade. The only thing they could do is, what Christian merchants wouldn't do is, right? So that's why Merchant of Venice, right? So they had to live within a walled space, in an unwalled city, and it was monitored by Christian guards. So there are modes of exclusion that were ensured through the making of walls, but they became very important. And that same thing with Shahjahanabad, Delhi. The walls, that's a place of toll collection. That's very important. That's not, that's again very typical of many cities across medieval, Europe, Asia. Other questions?
This was enough? Or
Yeah.
is this area? Is this how we are visualizing it? Or should I show the open section?
Let me. Okay, and nobody is going to comment from there. You have to come up and draw. So this is what. Listen to what I'm saying. This is an apple, stem up. Okay. You're going to cut horizontally. What will you see? That is the plan.
So this is the remaining part. I'm sorry for the not 2D effect, but this
So
is
that's very good. Okay, I think I got it. So this is the core, right?
right.
And this is a kind of a, if I manipulate scale, I get a little skin of that, right? So that's the wall. Okay, that's the inner space, and that's something else, right? Now, if I want to cut vertically, this is what I would get, right?
Yes. Half of it.
That's a section, okay? If you can now, thank you, extrapolate that to a building, you know how to do it. So plan is a horizontal. If you take a giant jacksaw and cut through the building, what you'll see perfectly orthogonal, like God seeing down, because you can't see like that. Okay? Everything that you'll cut through will show up in lines. Excuse me. And of the Medici Castle, okay, palace. So these are, you can recognize as walls, right? But they're walls because you're cutting through them. They're represented in darker lines because you're cutting through them, okay? It's solid material. What you're not cutting through will show up in either as blank space or in lighter lines. What is this?
Doors.
That's, what's that?
Windows.
It's a window.
Windows.
Why do you know, how do you know it's a window?
There are grills which bars are given there, so that it is not totally open space.
So it's not
partially-
totally opaque, not totally closed off. So in other words, so what is this line here?
It shows that it's the part of the structure, and it does not allow entry as an open area.
It doesn't. But what is that line? Why did they draw a line?
Could be
It's the frame actually, the frame of the window.
the material is different. I hope
The
that
material is different, but why a line?
less permanent, less temporary than the.
Yeah.
How thick is the walls?
It is not thick as the walls, and I'm feeling like I'm asking 20 questions here. Okay, because you are cutting through the window pane, which is thinner. Okay, so that's lines. In scale, it doesn't show up except as a line. Is that good? So if I cut through a window, so these are my walls, okay? Solid walls. I'm cutting in a plan. these two lines represent the window soffit, flat space. If I have a glass window, glass pane, it will show up as a thin line. Is that good? Because you're cutting through it. Okay. Now you can do fancy footwork and say, oh, my window opens. Then I have to show. It's usually not done like that. Why is it not done? Because it's a convention. Because those what I just drew like this, that's how we show doors. Okay. So that's the door leaf, that's the door opening. That opening is not real. It's, what did you just say? It's ephemeral, right? But that's how door swings are showed. Okay? So if you see something like, you should recognize, oh, that's the door. That's the door swing. The door swings are usually drawn because you have to clear that space. You cannot put anything there. Okay? It's very simple. It's not complicated. But if you get it conceptually, you would be able to read really complex plans. Now, the thing is that, so here is, what do you think this is?
Staircase.
It's a staircase, right? And these lines are the treads. Okay, they're called tread. Okay? The flat things are called treads. And the vertical things they're called risers. Okay? Tread, riser, okay? So you show the treads, right? So it's a circular staircase. Okay? There are more staircases here. Can you read where the staircases are? So there's one here. So you start here, and then why is this across here? Slash there. Why is that?
It's there.
No, it doesn't end there.
Is
It ends representationally there.
It's going upward.
It is going upward. Yeah, you're right. But why is it shown like that?
Separate norms convention so that people can easily recognize that it is going upward or downward.
Yeah, but you can also show a line. You will also see that. Up, down is very typical. The thing is, when you're cutting, the norm is you're cutting at 4 feet from the ground level. You will not see anything above 4 feet. So that slash line means that it's above the cut. Also means it's going up. Okay? Because that's part you can't see. Is that clear? Now, this one, for example, this is the main staircase actually. This is wider. It is a very large landing and it goes up. What is interesting is that sometimes plans are drawn rather carelessly and you would say, okay, why did they draw the whole staircase? You know, it doesn't show enough. You know, it didn't need to show all of that. Okay? But it is typical for plans to show walls where columns are distinct. The problem with doors, windows and staircases, they're actually drawn in various different modes. So sometimes you'll see doors, you could ask, where are the doors here? I don't see any door swings because they didn't show the doors at all. But that doesn't mean the building doesn't have doors, okay? So you need more information to actually fill out the picture, if you will. Okay? What it does, and this is important, is that it will typically have a scale. From a plan, you should be able to figure out how big things are. Okay? So this one says, this is in meters, so this is 10 meters. So I can imagine this is about 10 meters. Okay? So you should have a sense of a plan, a properly drawn plan should give you a sense of how big things are. Now these are things at the architectural scale. When we get to larger scales, you know, landscape and urban scales, one way to think about is of the land and how it's organized is begin with a street network. And this is why when Shuttle Hive doesn't have streets, it kind of goes like, I don't know how to do this. So one way of thinking is that you think of the distinction between land and street. And then think of other structures being layered on top. And over that land, here we have the plotting or the platting. These happen to be long lots, doesn't concern you. But in other words, this shows that given this format, there are two kinds of lots that have been carved out. So why are these lots so narrowly constructed? I mean, you can imagine you could have had one lot like that, like that. So why are these so many narrow lots? They're actually called narrow lots. It's long lots.
Particular social organization of spaces. If it was an agricultural land, let's assume it shows sub-infiltration of land.
I like that. This is not, a rural land, but that's actually could be one reason. In cities or even small towns, this is very typical, is because everybody wants a piece of that street. You want to be close to the street. So narrow lots are de rigueur. Narrow lots, long lots also became very important in medieval Europe because once they started using plows that were heavy to turn the train of whatever the animals they were using, it was more efficient to have a long space and then turn. Okay? But that is agricultural land, that's not urban land. So that's a lot plan. And then you can think about how to organize buildings in them. And there's nothing obvious about it. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you look at these buildings are smack right next to the street. The term is abutting the street. There's nothing obvious about it. Like, why did they do that? Because, well, clearly they wanted to be right next to the street. But there are other options. You can move away from the street to the middle of the lot, right? That's an option, right? And in other places you will find that. Here, what has happened is that they all built on the street. As a result, they have between themselves a large interior space through their backyards. This is very common in Spanish and medieval Europe, Spanish colonial and medieval European planning. Modern US planning, for example, or American planning, you will move away from the street. You'd have a front yard and you'd have a backyard. What that does to the building, it is exposed on all sides. Very difficult to control in terms of environment. But the move is ideological because you think that is a better way of living. So, but this also means that they are all right next to each other. Many of them will have, the term is party walls, common walls, or walls very close. But that also represents a social organization, and that's very important to recognize. So it could be about, how property has been shared and divided, but it also could be, think of it as a social contract. Okay? And we know from whether it's a village or a town, all property is organized based on some kind of social contract. Okay? Now, if we move to more complex situations, beyond this is a detail of a plan of Shanghai. Okay. Now, to parse this, you have to know what's happening here, or you need to really know a lot about urban plans. Can you guys read the plan? Can you figure out what's happening where? Yeah, there's a waterway. Yeah, the river is farther away, but these are the canals, right? Okay. So that's very important actually, because the streets follow the direction of the canals. And this is, the decisions, this is the infrastructural decisions that get made. What happened in Shanghai in the late 19th century is that American involvement in the land market in Shanghai ensured that a particular kind of lot division came up. Okay, and so for example, this lot here, it has a particular character. They're actually narrow lots, super narrow lots. But what is interesting is that the big roads are like this, crossroads are narrower. More you go inside, they're narrower. In other words, there's a clear hierarchy. So it's a very legible landscape. So you know what to anticipate. So you know what are the big streets, the next big streets, and then what are the lanes and the byways. So if you have that geography in mind, it's a very legible landscape. I think yeah. Once you get into that lane, street, this is the alley. These are the houses. Most urban plans will never show you houses. This one does because it's bringing in the architectural and the urban to show what kind of occupancy it has. Okay? But it's very effective in showing how this part of Shanghai was occupied, and it is a contemporary plan. So this is on the Lilong neighborhoods. Okay, the Lilong is the alley. Okay? These are the alley neighborhoods. And they're all right next to each other. They have party walls. But what they did, and this is the extraordinary part, is that they took the idea of the courtyard, which was central to, old Chinese houses, and still kept a bit of that, which is narrowed it down, which is not exceptional. We have that in Indian cities as well. But here it was done systematically, because this was speculative property. This is not people doing it individually. These were speculative property, and then people managed it in their own ways. So it has a very legible structure, actually. City plans. City plans are top views. Again, God looking down. You will never see it like that. This is a plan of the Greek colonial city of Miletus or Miletos. And Miletos had a great, it's a complex, very interesting history. But it had 3 major harbors. It was very important. And it was planned as a Greek colonial city. It was under Athenian hegemony. And military posse was stationed there to keep it under control. It's very much a colonial occupied situation. But the plan was by a guy named Hippodamus, who was local. And this is one of all Greek colonial cities are gridded. In other words, they're based on a grid. But Athens is not. Sparta is not. Something to think about. Why are colonial cities gridded? This is the norm, mind you. Spanish colonial cities are gridded. And that's the laws of the Indies. Dictates a grid. This is a gridded city. But there's something very interesting about the grid. There are 2 different kinds of grids, actually, 2 dimensions. This part was populated first, and all these are actually the major public spaces. And something to again think about. One of the things a Greek colonial city, all the building types you will find in Athens are replicated here, except in far more geometrical order, far more controlled, and fitted into that grid. So we can think about, why this one. I don't know whether I have another image or not. No, I don't. It is useful to think about why a colonial city is gridded. Well, I don't need to ask you. I think you can imagine it is control, right? But why does a grid give you better control? That's the question. How does a grid give you better control? Control of what?
People
Space?
and space, their movement.
Mobility.
Okay, one by one. You said what?
Mobility of the population.
So if people are moving through a curvy street, how is that different from people moving through a straight street?
Easier to control the grids.
It is easier to?
It's easier to control the mobility of people in a grid.
It is easier to control. Maybe. Okay. Yeah.
A grid-oriented plan projects order, which is what colonial control.
That is correct. In other words, it's a overt display of authority. That this is a geometrical grid, because it is absolutely unnatural. Okay, it is an imposition on the topography. And Miletus had a contour topography, it's on a hill actually. From the harbor it goes up. Okay. So yes, it does. You can control, but you really have to think about why. Why can you control it more? So if you think that's an overt imposition of authority, why is it an overt imposition of authority? Why do we assume that?
Because the grids are symmetrical, they are regular, they are like, they have fixed dimensions, they have some sort of scalar, let's say they are like quantitatively defined, that so in the measurements of.
So geometry equals power. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Yes.
Geometry, imposition of geometry is power. Okay, we'll stay with that. So that overt, the thing is that grid is, as a road system, let's say, or infrastructure, it is very efficient to set down. You know, cardinal north-south, east-west is the most, you know, it's easiest. If you ignore everything else, like, you know, all the contoured land, the fact that land is not paper. Okay, easy to draw on paper. On actual land is, you have to make compromises or you have to demolish that one of those two. So when you lay out a grid on a hill, it's really not flat, right? The flatness that's implied. So yes, there's something to do with the scalar manipulation. But so geometry equals power. What else is a grid good for?
Separation and classification. So we need to separate to show distinctiveness because the spaces need to be occupied by certain kind of professions of people. So different spaces for different people. That is the idea.
You know, in a country defined by the caste system, no grid was ever required to absolutely designate who can live where, right? So I'm hearing the nucleus of what you're saying there, but that's not why grids are used. You can actually apportion spaces in a non-gridded city just as well. But when you said it carries with it, that geometry carries with it with the principle of separation and classification, right? It is easier, you can say, to designate spaces within that. That doesn't mean when you look at a gridded space, those are hierarchical societies and non-gridded spaces. That's absolutely not. Okay. So it's useful to think about what else does a grid afford.
It makes transport and movement easier, far easier, because in elliptical and curved path, it seems different to travel from one location to another. So
Only if you are using modern transportation.
That time horse and several other types of
Horses can go.
And
Horses
even-
don't care for what? Straight roads. Horses are fine on hilly contours, etc. They don't care for straight roads. So modern transportation and modern plumbing grids are very useful. Okay, because with modern transportation, the goal is to go fast,
Yes.
and you know it requires a certain distance to make it easier, if that's one's goal. But in militaries, they're not thinking transportation. Believe me, they're not thinking transportation. It's still yeah.
I think grids also help in locating a particular place. That's like a lot faster with a grid and without one. Without one, it's more difficult.
It depends on whether you're used to a grid or not.
No, but then I mean, there can be numbers assigned to that particular grid with which I can help. I can locate a place faster than if I don't have a grid to look at a place.
So you're using the modern conception, the projection of a gridded space onto, it actually doesn't work like that. Okay, it doesn't. We are so used to grids and gridded spaces, we think that's easier, right? It's actually not easy. What you're missing here is that it's easier to march down an army through straight roads. Okay, that's probably the most important thing about a grid. And some of those roads would be wide. These are militarily occupied space. So you would want the army and in regalia marching down. And this is what would be, mostly infantry and some riders, okay? There are no complicated other, sort of guns of warfare at that time. But grids, modern grids, and there are many grids. I showed you an ancient grid. The piece that I asked you to read for today, which talks about Philadelphia, And Philadelphia is a modern grid. Okay, not 20th century grid, very much, you know, a 17th century grid, 17th, 18th century grid. And we need to understand different purposes of grids and how they function. So take a look at that, because I'm going to, in my afternoon lecture, I want to pick up on those things when we talk about city and commerce. Okay. How does it actually, why are gridded cities were thought important for commerce? Well, movement of goods and people, sure. Okay. But there was also an expectation that people would be abiding by those grids and rules. What if they don't? What happens then? You can intend any number of things, but who is to ensure it's, you know, that some people are obeying those rules, right? And typically people don't like obeying rules. Okay, they're not very happy with rules. Okay. So again, do you have any questions? Otherwise we can adjourn. No questions? You know, Abhishek and I talked yesterday, we apparently have to grade you guys. Okay, so I think I'm more worried about that than Abhishek is. So if you don't ask a question, we don't know how to grade you, okay? Now that I've put the fear of grade in you, you should be asking questions and answering them, yes?
Ma'am, you did mention that the colonial cities were based
Not
on
all,
grid
but
model
many
mostly.
were.
Should we study a little more about the ungridded city model that where the colonialists themselves came from?
I might throw in an example, since I mentioned Athens, image of Athens and the building types of tomorrow's lecture. We will be talking about ungridded colonial cities and impossible to, you know, put a grid on it like Calcutta. Okay, because they were not based on a grid. Anglo Asian planning is actually not based on grids. And grid is a latecomer and only in cantonments, so it tells you something. Okay. But Spanish colonial towns and Americas all gridded. Okay. And the legacy is very old. Greek cities were, colonial cities were gridded.
So cantonments have the gridded.
Sorry?
So cantonments have the gridded.
Cantonments are, even if it's an imperfect grid, there is a certain grid structure in it. India has very few gridded cities, and it's because our legacies, you know, Mughal cities were not gridded. Okay, they had a clear infrastructure, so you knew exactly where to go because of what they were based on. You know, if you think about Shahjahanabad, you have the old fort, right? The fort, and then you have the chowk, right? So that's a straight street, and that leads to the gate, Lahori Gate, right? Yes. And then you have the rest of the city is divided into mahallas, right? And mahallas is because they were, nobles were assigned those, given land grant to develop those mahallas. So they had to, you know, settle populations, artisans, and develop those. So it's based on a very different logic. But once you know that logic, you know how to navigate the space. And the way, because I think of the Shahjahanabad in terms of this plan, and so this is the Yamuna here. So on the other side, they used to be vast gardens, and those were endowments of the women of the Mughal family. So we don't think about, you know, Shahjahanabad in terms of women patrons. It was a major contribution of women patrons into the organization of the city. So the way to think about is that the bottom part of the city were the most concentrated mahallas and where the Jama Masjid is. But the other side was actually much more sparse. But beyond that, there was also the outer city with the ganjs and mandis and all of that. So, but that logic is very clear. It doesn't have to be a grid, which it can still have a very clear logic. But grids are the modern city. Chandigarh is a gridded city, okay, and it's a. Okay, let's not. I can't see.
I'm Gyali, and I work on questions of identity. Okay, before that I am a PhD scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IT Silchar, and I work on questions of identity, Bengali identity.
I'm Subhash, and I'm also a PhD scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Science, and I work on the citizenship studies.
I'm Devesh Pandey. I'm a PhD scholar from the Department of Medieval and Modern History, University of Lucknow, and my research area is on the development of railways within cities, and especially looking on the development of railways within colonial Lucknow. Yes, thank you.
My name is Indra Bhaskar Misra. I am a student of Department of Sociology. I'm also a research scholar, and my research area is basically studying how rituals are getting affected. Hindu basically rituals are getting affected by market economics.
In cities?
In Vrindavan especially.
Oh, in Vrindavan in particular, okay.
I'm Shilpa. I've come from Bangalore. I'm a PhD scholar at Christ University. So my work is in the field of literary urban studies, and I'm mainly looking at mapping literature narrative to discuss on urban discourses of crisis, resilience and resistance through characters and the narrative.
Hi, I'm Athena and I'm also from Bangalore. So I'm a PhD scholar in cultural studies from Christ University. So I work on the idea of how the role of DMTC buses, which plays a role in shaping the cultural identity of Bangalore.
Hello everyone, I am Ketanushree. I am from IIT Kanpur. My thesis is basically to do with literary study of architectural structures, mainly specifically walls in select dystopian fiction, and the title is Walls in Dystopian Space-Time. I am looking at dystopias, the speculative narrative, as a space-time in my thesis.
Hello, my name is Prashant Kumar Pandey. I am a research scholar at Central University of South Bihar, and I am working on pandemic literature. So how pandemic this is being affected by the landscape and the several other socio-cultural dimensions. So this is.
Hello everyone, I am Nick. I am from Kolkata and I am currently a doctoral scholar at Institute of Development Studies Kolkata, and I am currently working on football and identity and the economic dimensions of football in post-colonial Calcutta.
Hello, I'm Rick. I'm currently doing my master's in history from presidency. I'm interested in questions of art history and the art market, more specifically post-colonial Bengali modern art.
Okay, very good. Now that I hope I'll remember some of these names, but in a few days I'll remember. So, I'm a bad historian. I always say I forget names and dates. So what's our next thing?
Break for lunch and continue at 3:50.
Okay.